Victoria Harrington slammed her hand on the podium so hard the microphone screeched. $3 million, she shouted at a room full of reporters. To anyone who can make that engine start. Behind her, an $80 million jet sat dead silent, humiliating her company in front of the entire world. 6 days, 0 answers. But what nobody in that hangar knew was that the man who would end her nightmare was already walking past the door, carrying nothing but a scratched-up toolbox and his dead father's handwritten notebook. If you're watching this from a small town, a quiet suburb, or a city, nobody talks about, comment below and tell me where you're watching from, because I want to see how far this story has traveled. And if stories like this move you, hit subscribe, because what happens next will stay with you long after the video ends. The hangar was too quiet. That was the first thing Victoria Harrington noticed every time she stepped through the side door into Hangar 7, and it was the thing that scared her more than any spreadsheet, any board meeting, any hostile takeover rumor ever had. A hangar built to house engines that could roar loud enough to rattle a man's ribs from 50 feet away had no business being this quiet. And yet, for 6 days now, that was exactly what it had been. Silent. Dead. She stood at the edge of the tarmac line, painted in faded yellow on the concrete floor. Arms crossed over her tailored blazer, staring at the Gulfstream G700 like it had personally betrayed her. In a way it had. Every dollar, every hour, every ounce of reputation she had spent building Harrington Aerospace into a name that mattered was sitting right there in front of her, gleaming and useless. "Talk to me," she said without turning around. Her voice was flat-controlled, the voice of a woman who had learned a long time ago that panic was a luxury she couldn't afford in front of employees. "Somebody tell me something I don't already know." Behind her, 4 men in matching navy jumpsuits exchanged glances. None of them wanted to be the one to answer. Finally, the oldest of them, a man named Dennis Cole, chief engineer, 26 years in aviation, 3 degrees on his office wall, cleared his throat. "Ms. Harrington, we've run the diagnostics 11 times. We've replaced the ignition relay, the fuel control unit, both engine computers. We flew in 2 specialists from the manufacturer in Savannah. We even had someone from the Air Force consult off the books as a favor." He paused. "We don't know." "You don't know," Victoria repeated slowly, like the words tasted bad in her mouth. "No, ma'am." She turned around then, and the look on her face made even Dennis Cole, a man who had once talked down a mid-air fire over the Atlantic, take half a step back. 6 days, she said. 6 days, Dennis. This jet was supposed to fly a delegation of investors to Zurich 4 days ago. Do you understand what that means? Do you understand what people are saying about this company right now because a $200 million deal fell through over an $80 million paperweight sitting in my own hangar?" Nobody answered. Nobody had an answer. Victoria pressed 2 fingers against her temple, closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. She counted them. She always counted them. It was the only trick that kept her voice steady and opened them again. "Get everyone out," she said. "I need a minute." The engineers filed out without a word, their boots echoing against the concrete in a way that only deepened the silence they left behind. Victoria stood alone in front of the jet, the enormous white fuselage stretching out above her like the rib cage of some beached whale. And for just a moment, a single private moment, she would never admit to anyone, her shoulders dropped. She was 38 years old. She had inherited this company from a father who never once told her he was proud of her, and she had spent the last 11 years proving to a boardroom full of men twice her age that she deserved to sit at the head of the table. She had done it. She had turned Harrington Aerospace from a struggling regional charter service into one of the most respected private aviation companies on the East Coast. She had done it by never showing weakness, never showing doubt, never ever losing control. And now, a machine, not even a person, not even a rival company was making a fool of her in front of the entire industry. She pulled out her phone and stared at the screen for a long moment before she typed a message to her communications director. "Set up a press conference. Tomorrow morning. Front of Hangar 7. 3 dots appeared almost instantly. "What's the angle?" Victoria looked up at the jet one more time. "The angle is money," she typed. Money gets attention. Attention gets answers. The next morning, the tarmac outside Hangar 7 was crowded in a way it had never been crowded before. News vans lined the access road. Cameras were mounted on tripods in a loose semicircle facing a small podium that had been wheeled out an hour earlier. Reporters murmured to each other, coffee cups in hand. None of them entirely sure why the notoriously private CEO of Harrington Aerospace had suddenly decided to hold a press conference about, of all things, a broken airplane. Victoria stepped up to the podium in a charcoal suit. Her dark hair pulled back tight, her expression unreadable. She had done this 100 times. Product launches, earnings calls, the occasional damage control statement when a competitor tried to poach a client. She knew how to stand. She knew how to breathe between sentences so her voice never wavered. She did not know standing there that this particular press conference would be the one people remembered for years. "Thank you all for coming on short notice," she began. "I'll keep this brief because I know your time is valuable, and frankly so is mine." A ripple of quiet laughter. She let it pass. 6 days ago, our newest aircraft, a state-of-the-art Gulfstream G700, representing the very best of what modern aviation engineering can produce, experienced a failure that has so far defeated every specialist we've brought in to examine it. And I mean every specialist. Engineers from the manufacturer, independent avionics consultants, even a former Air Force technician with over 2 decades of experience. She paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to matter. "Nobody can tell me what's wrong with my own airplane." A few reporters exchanged glances. Someone in the back muttered something to a colleague. "So I'm doing something I've never done before," Victoria continued. "I'm opening this problem up to anyone, any technician, any engineer, any mechanic in this country who believes they can diagnose and repair this aircraft. I am offering $3 million. The murmur in the crowd turned into an audible gasp. $3 million, she repeated, to whoever can get that jet's engines running again before the end of this week. No corporate sponsorship required, no degree required. I don't care where you trained or who you work for. I care whether you can fix what my own top engineers cannot." Hands shot up immediately. Victoria pointed to a reporter in the front row. "Ms. Harrington, is this a publicity stunt?" Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "This is a company that builds its reputation on precision and reliability," she said. "Right now, that reputation is sitting broken in a hangar behind me. This isn't a publicity stunt. This is me admitting publicly that I need help. Something I imagine none of you expected to hear from me." That line ended up on every evening broadcast that night. By nightfall, the story had gone further than Victoria had ever imagined. Aviation forums exploded with theories. Amateur mechanics posted videos speculating about faulty sensors and corroded wiring harnesses. A retired NASA engineer wrote a 6,000-word blog post about electromagnetic interference. News outlets in 3 different countries picked up the story, running headlines that ranged from admiring to mocking. "CEO offers millions to fix what her own engineers can't." Harrington Aerospace's $3 million mystery. The jet that broke a billion-dollar company's pride. Within 48 hours, more than 300 people had formally applied to attempt the repair. Engineers flew in from Texas, from California, from as far away as Germany and Japan. Corporate teams from rival aviation firms arrived with matching branded jackets, cameras trailing them, treating the whole event like a marketing opportunity disguised as generosity. Every single one of them failed. They came in with confidence, some of them, frankly, with arrogance, certain that whatever the Harrington engineers had missed, they would find in an hour. They left one by one, quiet and humbled, unable to explain why an aircraft, with no visible mechanical defect, simply refused to breathe life into its own engines. By the 5th day of the public challenge, Victoria had stopped attending the demonstrations in person. She watched from her office window, instead arms folded, jaw set, as yet another team of specialists packed up their equipment and walked away shaking their heads. Her assistant, a sharp young woman named Priya, knocked softly on the open door. "Ms. Harrington." "What?" "The board wants a call." They're asking whether it's time to just write the aircraft off. Insurance replacement, the whole thing. They're saying the press attention is starting to work against us instead of for us. Victoria didn't turn from the window. Tell them I said no. They're going to push back. Let them push. Her voice was quiet, but there was steel underneath it. I am not writing off an $80 million aircraft because nobody's had the patience to actually look at it properly. Somebody built that jet. Somebody understands why it's failing. I refuse to believe the answer doesn't exist. Priya hesitated in the doorway. There's one more thing. What? There's a man downstairs. Says he wasn't part of the official challenge. He was just dropping off a repaired navigation unit for one of the smaller charter jets in Hangar 3, but he walked past Hangar 7 on his way out and asked one of the techs if he could take a look. Victoria finally turned around. And the tech laughed at him, said he didn't even have a company badge, just a toolbox and some old notebook. For a long moment, Victoria said nothing. She thought about the 300 applicants, the engineers with 3 degrees each, the retired NASA scientist, the corporate teams in their branded jackets, all of them gone defeated with nothing to show for it but embarrassment and a wasted trip. What's his name? She asked. Priya glanced down at a small notepad. Carter. Michael Carter. What? Michael Carter had not planned on being anywhere near Hangar 7 that morning. He'd woken up at 5:15, same as every day, in the small 2-bedroom house he shared with his 8-year-old daughter Lily, on the edge of a neighborhood most people in this city had never had a reason to drive through. He'd made her lunch peanut butter, no crusts, an apple cut into slices because she refused to eat them. Hull walked her the 4 blocks to Jefferson Elementary and kissed the top of her head at the gate, the way he did every single morning without fail. Are you going to be late tonight, Dad? She'd asked, backpack straps clutched in both small hands. Not too late, baby girl. I've got a delivery out at the airfield, then I'm coming straight home. We'll do the puzzle. The one with the lighthouse. The one with the lighthouse. She'd smiled that gap-toothed smile that still made something in his chest ache with love every single time he saw it, and run off toward the school doors without looking back the way kids do when they trust completely, and without question that the person who loves them will be there waiting at the end of the day. Michael had climbed back into his 14-year-old pickup truck, the one with a check engine light that had been on so long he'd started to consider it decorative, and driven the 40 minutes out to the regional airfield, where Harrington Aerospace kept its private fleet. He wasn't supposed to be there for any reason other than a small delivery. A local charter company, one of the few clients small enough to actually hire an independent avionics repairman instead of a corporate service contract, had asked him to drop off a repaired navigation unit for one of their jets in Hangar 3. It was routine. It was the kind of job that paid his rent and not much more. He hadn't expected the entire access road to be lined with news vans. He hadn't expected the crowd of onlookers pressed against a chain-link fence, phones raised, filming a hangar like it was a crime scene. And he certainly hadn't expected, as he carried the small repaired unit toward Hangar 3, to overhear 2 technicians standing near the fence line talking in low, frustrated voices. Another team just left, one of them was saying, shaking his head. 4th group this week. Nobody can even get a consistent error code out of the thing. It's like the computer's lying to us. The other man laughed, humorless. $3 million, and not a single person's cracked it. Manufacturer's own people couldn't figure it out. What hope does anybody else have? Michael slowed his steps. He didn't mean to. It was an old habit one his father had drilled into him without ever meaning to, the reflex of stopping just for a second whenever he heard someone describe a problem that didn't add up. It's like the computer's lying to us. He stood there a moment longer than he should have, the repaired navigation unit tucked under one arm, staring at the enormous white hangar in the distance, with its doors rolled halfway open, revealing just a sliver of the aircraft inside. His father's voice rose up in his memory, unbidden the way it always did at moments like this. Before replacing hardware, understand why the system is afraid. Robert Carter had been dead for 6 years now, but there were moments more than Michael liked to admit when it felt like his father had never really left. Moments when a problem crossed his path and some old, worn groove in his mind lit up exactly the way it used to when he was 19 years old, sitting across a workbench from his father in their cramped garage, watching the old man trace a wire with one calloused finger and mutter half to himself, half to Michael about the difference between a machine that's broken and a machine that's scared. A computer doesn't lie, son. It just protects itself when it doesn't understand what it's being told. Your job isn't to force it. Your job is to figure out what frightened it in the first place. Michael shook his head, half smiling at himself. It wasn't his problem. He had a delivery to make, an invoice to collect, and a lighthouse puzzle waiting for him at home with a little girl who was counting on him to be there. He turned toward Hangar 3, and then, almost against his own will, he glanced one more time toward Hangar 7. A man near the fence, one of the younger techs, maybe mid-20s, wearing the same navy jumpsuit as the others, caught him looking. "You need something, buddy?" The tech called out, not unkindly, just curious. Michael hesitated. He thought about Lily. He thought about the rent that was due in 9 days. He thought about how badly his business had been struggling ever since a large maintenance conglomerate had opened a facility 20 minutes from his shop and started undercutting every independent repairman within 50 miles. He thought about his father's notebook sitting on the passenger seat of his truck, the leather cover cracked and soft from 40 years of use. "No," he said. "Just curious what all the fuss is about." The tech snorted. $80 million jet's been dead for 6 days. Whole world's trying to fix it. Nobody can. "What's it doing?" Michael asked. He didn't know why he asked. The words just came out of him, quiet and automatic. The tech shrugged. "Nothing. That's the thing. Won't start. No fault codes that make sense. Every system checks out fine individually, but the second you try to bring the engines online, everything just locks up. Like the whole aircraft panics." Michael felt something shift in his chest. A small, quiet click like a key turning in a lock he hadn't known was there, like the whole aircraft panics. "Mind if I take a look?" he heard himself ask. The tech blinked at him, then laughed, not cruelly, just genuinely surprised. "Man, we've had literal aerospace engineers in there, guys with 3 degrees. A team flew in from Germany yesterday. What exactly are you gonna—" "Just 5 minutes," Michael said. "I'm not asking for anything. I'm not trying to win the money. I just want to look at the diagnostic screen." The tech glanced back toward the hangar, then at Michael's truck, then at the small toolbox in Michael's hand, and something in his expression softened. Not respect, not yet, just the mild curiosity of a man who'd watched too many overconfident specialists fail that week, and was frankly a little entertained by the idea of watching one more attempt. "You're not even on the list," the tech said. "You'd have to go through the front office sign and get cleared by security." "Then let me do that," Michael said simply. "I've got time." The tech studied him for a long moment. Michael Carter didn't look like anything special. Faded work jacket, boots that had seen better years, a tired kind of steadiness in his eyes that came from a man who worked with his hands for a living and didn't waste words he didn't mean. "All right," the tech said finally, almost against his own better judgment. "I'll walk you up to the office. Can't promise they'll let you in, though. Ms. Harrington's people have been pretty picky about who gets near that jet." Michael nodded, tucked the navigation unit back under his arm. He'd deliver it after he decided, and followed the young technician toward the front office, his father's notebook still sitting untouched on the passenger seat of a truck parked 40 yards away waiting. The front office of Harrington Aerospace's private hangar complex was nothing like Michael had expected. Glass walls, polished floors, a wall of photographs showing sleek white aircraft against sunset skies, each one more impressive than the last. He felt distinctly out of place standing in the middle of it in his work jacket, holding a repaired navigation unit like it was some kind of admission ticket. Priya, Victoria's assistant, looked up from her desk with the practiced polite skepticism of someone who had turned away a dozen unqualified hopefuls that week alone. "Can I help you?" "My name's Michael Carter," he said. "I do avionics repair. I was dropping off a unit next door, and I heard about the aircraft in Hangar 7. I'd like to take a look if that's possible." Priya's eyes flicked briefly to his jacket. his boots, the small worn toolbox in his hand, and Michael watched the assumption form behind her eyes before she'd even said a word. "Do you have a company affiliation, a certification number? We've had specialists coming through with credentials from Gulfstream Boeing, several branches of the military." "I worked avionics for 12 years in the Army," Michael said evenly. "I've run my own repair shop for the last 6. I don't have a corporate badge. I don't have a team behind me. I've just got some experience and a feeling about what might be going on." Priya's expression didn't change much, but there was the faintest, almost imperceptible softening around her eyes. Not belief exactly, but the recognition of a man who wasn't posturing, wasn't performing for cameras the way half the applicants that week had been. "I'll need to check with Ms. Harrington," she said. "Please wait here." She disappeared down the short hallway, and Michael stood alone in the glass-walled office, listening to the muffled hum of activity outside engines. Somewhere in the distance, the occasional burst of a radio, the low murmur of reporters still camped along the fence line half a mile away. He thought about Lily, about the lighthouse puzzle, about how strange it was that a delivery run had turned into this standing, in a place he had no business being about to ask permission to touch a problem that had already defeated the best specialists on the planet. Before replacing hardware, his father's voice whispered again, "Understand why the system is afraid." Priya returned a few minutes later, her expression unreadable. "Ms. Harrington will see you." Victoria Harrington's office was on the second floor, overlooking the tarmac, with a direct line of sight to Hangar 7's rolled-open doors. She was standing at the window when Michael was shown in, her back to the door, arms crossed, the posture of a woman who had spent 6 days absorbing failure after failure, and had very little patience left for another one. "Mr. Carter," she said without turning around. "My assistant tells me you're an independent repairman, no corporate backing, no formal engineering degree, is that correct?" "That's correct." "And you believe you can succeed where 12 of the top specialists in this industry, men and women with decades of combined experience, have failed?" Michael didn't flinch. "I don't know if I can fix it, Ms. Harrington. I haven't seen it yet, but I heard something a few minutes ago that made me want to look." That got her attention. She finally turned around, studying him with the same sharp, assessing gaze she used in board meetings, the one that had made grown executives sweat through their suits. "What did you hear?" "One of your technicians said the aircraft panics when you try to bring the engines online. Everything checks out individually, but the moment you push it toward starting, the whole system locks up." He paused. "That's not a broken machine, Ms. Harrington. That's a scared one." Victoria's eyebrows drew together slightly. "Scared. My father used to say it that way. He spent 40 years repairing military aircraft, and he always told me machines don't lie. But sometimes they protect themselves when they think something's wrong, even if nothing actually is. You start chasing the wrong thing when you assume it's a hardware failure. Sometimes the real problem is that the system's being told a story it doesn't trust." Victoria stared at him for a long moment. 6 days of failure had worn a particular kind of exhaustion into her, not physical tiredness, but the deeper, more corrosive fatigue of watching expert after expert, credential after credential, walk into that hangar with total confidence and walk out with nothing. She had heard theories about corroded wiring, electromagnetic interference, faulty sensors, software bugs, manufacturing defects. She had heard 6 days' worth of expensive, sophisticated, utterly useless explanations. She had never heard anyone describe her aircraft as scared. "You have 5 minutes, she said finally. "Dennis will be with you the entire time. You touch nothing without explaining exactly what you're doing and why. Is that understood?" "Understood. And Mr. Carter," she added as he turned to leave. He paused, glancing back. "If this is some kind of stunt to get attention for your business, I promise you the consequences will be significantly worse than simple embarrassment." Michael met her eyes steadily. "I'm not here for the money, and I'm not here for attention, Ms. Harrington. I heard a problem that reminded me of something my father used to say, and I couldn't walk away without at least looking. That's the whole truth of it." Something in his voice, quiet, unguarded, utterly without performance, made Victoria hold his gaze a moment longer than she intended to. 5 minutes, she said again, softer this time. Dennis will meet you at the hangar. Dennis Cole did not bother hiding his skepticism as he walked Michael across the tarmac toward Hangar 7. 26 years of engineering experience had taught him plenty of things, and one of them was that confidence without credentials usually meant trouble. "You understand," Dennis said, as they approached the massive open doors. "We've had actual specialists from the manufacturer go through every inch of this aircraft, twice. We've replaced components that had zero indication of failure just to rule things out. I don't say this to be rude, Mr. Carter, but I need you to understand the scope of what's already been tried." "I understand," Michael said simply. Dennis studied him sideways. "You were Army. 12 years. Avionics. Sea combat. Some." Dennis nodded slowly, something shifting behind his eyes. Not full respect, not yet, but the beginning of it. Men who'd served had a way of recognizing each other, a kind of shorthand that didn't need many words. They stepped through the open hangar doors, and the Gulfstream G700 loomed above them, enormous and silent. Its white fuselage catching the light streaming in through the high windows. Michael felt something settle in his chest at the sight of it. Not intimidation exactly, but a kind of quiet focus. The same feeling he used to get standing in front of a downed helicopter in the field, knowing that somewhere inside all that complexity was a single simple truth waiting to be found. "Diagnostic terminals this way," Dennis said, leading him toward a small mobile workstation set up beside the aircraft's open avionics bay. A handful of engineers and technicians had gathered nearby, alerted by whispers that someone new was attempting the challenge, their expressions ranging from curious to openly doubtful. Michael set his toolbox down, but didn't open it. Instead, he pulled up a stool in front of the terminal and studied the screen for a long moment without touching anything. "You said 5 minutes," Dennis reminded him, checking his watch. "I know." The engineers around him exchanged glances. Someone near the back muttered something that made another person stifle a laugh. Michael ignored all of it, his eyes moving slowly, methodically across the diagnostic readout. Not the error codes flashing across the top of the screen, the ones that had consumed 6 days of everyone else's attention, but the startup sequence log scrolling beneath them, the quiet, unglamorous data nobody had bothered to really read. "Everybody's been looking at the failure," Michael said quietly, mostly to himself. "Nobody's been looking at what happened right before it." Dennis frowned. "We've reviewed the startup sequence a dozen times." "Reviewed the errors in it," Michael said. "Not the sequence itself." He scrolled back further past the failure point into the initialization data. The handshake between the aircraft's dual navigation systems, the quiet exchange of information that happened in the half-second before any human ever saw a warning light. His eyes narrowed slightly. "There," he said almost to himself. "There what?" Dennis leaned in. Michael pointed to a small, almost invisible discrepancy in the timestamp data, a fraction of a second mismatch between two systems that were supposed to be perfectly synchronized. It was the kind of detail that a machine built to prioritize speed and efficiency would flag as an inconsistency worth investigating. And a safety-critical aircraft faced with an inconsistency it couldn't fully explain would do exactly what it had been engineered to do. It would refuse to move. "When was the last software update pushed to this aircraft?" Michael asked. Dennis blinked. "About a week before the failure started. Standard navigation database refresh. Routine." "Not routine enough," Michael murmured. He sat back slightly, and for the first time since walking into the hangar, something like certainty settled across his face. "I don't think your engines are broken, Mr. Cole," he said quietly. "I don't think anything on this aircraft is actually broken at all." Dennis stared at him. Behind them, the small crowd of engineers had gone very, very quiet. "Then what is it?" Dennis asked. Michael looked back at the screen at that tiny, almost invisible fraction of a second discrepancy that had brought an $80 million aircraft, and in its own way, an entire company's reputation to its knees. "I think your two systems are arguing with each other," he said. and the aircraft's too smart and too careful to fly until somebody makes them agree. Nobody said a word. Somewhere behind them, unnoticed by everyone in that hangar, Victoria Harrington had stepped quietly through the side door, drawn by a message from Dennis that had simply read, "You need to see this." She stood in the shadow near the entrance, arms crossed, watching a man in a faded work jacket lean toward a screen that had defeated the best minds in the industry, and for the first time in 6 days, she felt something loosen in her chest that felt dangerously cautiously like hope. Victoria didn't move from the shadow near the entrance. She just stood there watching a man she had known for less than an hour lean over a screen that had swallowed the confidence of every expert she'd brought in. And she felt something she hadn't let herself feel in 6 days, the smallest, most fragile flicker of possibility. Dennis was the one who broke the silence. "You're telling me the aircraft is refusing to start because 2 systems disagree about a fraction of a second?" "I'm telling you that's what it looks like from here," Michael said. "I'd need to go deeper to be sure. But everything about this points the same direction. The engines aren't damaged. The fuel system's fine. The airframe's fine. The computer just doesn't trust what it's being told, so it's protecting itself the only way it knows how, by refusing to fly." One of the younger engineers standing near the back, a woman with a tablet clutched to her chest, spoke up before she could stop herself. "That's not in any manual. That's not a documented failure mode for this aircraft." "No," Michael agreed. "Probably isn't. Most manuals are written by people trying to predict every way a machine can break. Not every way it can get confused." He glanced up at her, not unkindly. "Those aren't always the same thing." Nobody in the hangar said anything for a moment. Somewhere above them, a maintenance fan hummed steadily, the only sound besides the low murmur of a dozen people trying to process what they'd just heard. Victoria stepped forward finally out of the shadow, and every head in the hangar turned toward her at once. The engineers straightened. Dennis cleared his throat. Michael simply stood unhurried and met her eyes the same steady way he had in her office 20 minutes earlier. "5 minutes were up 3 minutes ago, Mr. Carter," she said. "I know. And yet you're still here. You didn't tell me to stop." A small, almost imperceptible line appeared at the corner of Victoria's mouth, not quite a smile, but close enough that Dennis noticed it and filed the observation away with quiet surprise. He hadn't seen that particular expression on her face in 6 days. "Walk me through it," Victoria said. "Everything you just told Dennis. Tell me again slower, and don't leave anything out." Michael nodded and turned back to the terminal, pulling up the same startup sequence log he'd been studying moments before. "Your team's been focused on the error codes," he said, "because that's what the system throws at you first. Big, obvious, flashing red text, completely understandable. Anyone would start there." He scrolled the screen back past the failure point into the quieter data underneath. "But an error code just tells you the aircraft stopped. It doesn't tell you why it got scared enough to stop in the first place." "Scared." Victoria repeated the same word she'd questioned in her office. "It's not the technical term," Michael admitted. "But it's the truest one I know. This aircraft has 2 navigation systems that are supposed to talk to each other constantly, confirming they agree on where the plane is, what it's doing, what state it's in. When your team pushed that update a week before this started, something in the handshake between those 2 systems got thrown off. Not broken, just off. A timing mismatch so small, most systems wouldn't even register it as a problem. But this one did," Victoria said. "This one did," Michael confirmed. "Because Gulfstream builds safety into every layer of this aircraft, and one of those layers is designed specifically to catch inconsistencies between critical systems before they ever reach the pilot. It's supposed to be a good thing. It's supposed to save lives." He paused. "Right now, it's just saving the aircraft from a mistake that isn't actually there." Dennis frowned, arms crossed, working through the logic out loud. "So the safety protocol thinks there's a genuine conflict between the navigation systems, when really it's just a timing artifact from the update." "That's my read on it," Michael said. "I want to be honest with you, I haven't confirmed it yet. I've been in here for 8 minutes. I'd need real time with the initialization files to know for certain." Victoria studied him for a long moment, and in that silence Michael watched her make some private calculation behind her eyes, weighing 6 days of expert failure against 8 minutes of a stranger's instinct, weighing the embarrassment of being wrong publicly against the cost of never trying. "How much time do you need?" she asked finally. "An hour, maybe less." "You had 5 minutes. You gave me those 5 minutes to see if I was wasting your time," Michael said quietly. "I don't think I am." Something passed between them in that moment, not quite trust, not yet, but the beginning of something that could become trust if given the room to grow. Victoria turned to Dennis. "Give him whatever he needs. Full access to the initialization files. I want someone documenting everything he does in case—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "In case it works, and we need to understand exactly what happened for our own records." Dennis nodded, though Michael could see the tension still sitting in his shoulders. The quiet discomfort of a man who had spent 26 years, earning his expertise, now watching an outsider get handed the exact access that expertise had failed to unlock. "Mr. Carter," Dennis said not unkindly, "I want to be clear. I'm not against you being here. I'm against false hope. This company's employees have been under enormous pressure for 6 days. If you get their hopes up and this doesn't pan out—" "I understand," Michael said. "I've been on the other side of false hope before. I won't do that to your people if I can help it." Something about the way he said it, plain, unadorned, without a trace of defensiveness, seemed to settle something in Dennis. He exhaled slowly and gestured toward the terminal. "All right," he said. "Show me." Michael worked for the next 40 minutes in near total silence, and the hangar around him slowly filled with more people than it had held all week. Not because anyone had announced anything, but because word moved through a workplace the way it always did, quietly, urgently, from one person to the next. "There's a guy in Hangar 7. Might have actually found something." By the time Michael was deep into the initialization files, tracing the handshake protocol line by line, there were nearly 30 employees gathered at a respectful distance watching. Victoria stood closest, arms still crossed. Though the posture had softened somewhat from the rigid, controlled stance she'd carried into the hangar. She watched Michael's hands move across the keyboard, not fast, not flashy, but deliberate, the way a surgeon's hands moved, each action considered before it was taken. "You work like your father taught you," she said at one point, not quite a question. Michael didn't look up. "Everything I know I learned from him, directly or indirectly. He was in the military too. Air Force, then private contract work. 40 years total, give or take. Worked on everything from fighter jets to commercial airliners." Michael's fingers paused briefly over the keyboard. "Passed away 6 years ago." "I'm sorry. Thank you." He resumed typing. "He left me a notebook, handwritten. 40 years of notes on things he learned that never made it into any official manual. I still carry it with me. It's actually sitting in my truck right now. I almost brought it in, but I figured showing up with a beat-up old notebook wasn't going to help my case with your security team." Victoria almost laughed, a small, surprised sound that she quickly suppressed, like it had escaped before she'd given herself permission to feel it. Probably a fair assessment. Around them, the gathered employees exchanged quiet glances, some clearly moved by the exchange. Others simply relieved to hear conversation, instead of the tense, exhausted silence that had defined the hangar for nearly a week. "There," Michael said, suddenly sitting back slightly. Dennis stepped forward immediately. "What is it?" Michael pointed to a section of code on the screen, a corrupted initialization file, barely a few kilobytes in size, buried deep within the navigation system's startup sequence. To anyone without specific training, it would have looked like meaningless text. To Michael, it looked like the answer to a question that had cost a company millions of dollars and 6 days of public humiliation. "This file got corrupted during the update," he said. "Not in a way that would trigger a normal error. It's not missing data. It's not obviously malformed. It's just slightly wrong. Off by a value so small, most systems would round past it without a second thought. But this aircraft doesn't round past anything," Dennis said slowly, understanding dawning across his face. "This aircraft double-checks everything, Michael confirmed. Every single time without exception, because that's exactly what it's supposed to do. And every single time it checks this particular file, it finds an inconsistency. It can't resolve. So it does the only thing its programming allows. It refuses to proceed. It's not malfunctioning, Mr. Cole. It's doing exactly what it was built to do. It's just protecting itself from a threat that isn't real. The hangar had gone completely silent. 30 people, none of them breathing quite normally, watched a single father in a faded work jacket point at a few kilobytes of corrupted code that had defeated the combined expertise of an entire industry. "Can you fix it?" Victoria asked. Her voice was steady, controlled, but Michael could hear something underneath it now, something raw and cautiously hopeful that she wasn't quite able to fully suppress anymore. Michael studied the file for another long moment. "I can rebuild it," he said. "I've seen corruption patterns like this before in other systems, other contexts. It's not identical, but the principle's the same. I'll need to reconstruct the correct values manually and push a clean version back into the startup sequence." "How long?" 20 minutes, maybe less if nothing else surprises me." Dennis stepped closer, studying the screen himself. Now his earlier skepticism visibly giving way to something more complicated. Professional humility mixed with genuine curiosity. "How did you even think to look here?" "We ran full diagnostics on every system component. Nobody flagged this file as a point of failure, because everyone was looking for something broken," Michael said simply. "Nobody was looking for something almost right." That's the hardest kind of problem to find, because almost right doesn't throw an alarm. It just makes the system quietly nervous, and nervous systems don't announce themselves the way broken ones do. He glanced up at Dennis, and there was no condescension in his expression, only a kind of tired, hard-won understanding. "My father used to say the most dangerous mistakes are the ones that look almost like the truth. A completely broken system everybody notices right away. A system that's 99% correct, that's the one that fools you for 6 days." Dennis exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. 26 years, he muttered mostly to himself. 26 years, and I've never had a single instructor put it that way. "Wasn't a lesson from an instructor," Michael said quietly, already turning back to the keyboard. "Wasn't from a classroom at all." Word had reached the reporters outside within the hour, not through any official statement, but through the same quiet, unstoppable current of whispers that had summoned 30 employees into the hangar. By the time Michael began reconstructing the corrupted file, a fresh wave of camera crews had repositioned themselves closer to the hangar's open doors, sensing that something was different this time. Something that smelled less like another failed attempt and more like the beginning of an ending. Victoria noticed the shift in energy outside, and for the first time in 6 days, didn't feel dread at the sight of cameras. She felt something closer to anticipation, though she refused to let herself trust it fully. She had watched too many confident specialists fail to let hope get ahead of results. Still, she found herself standing closer to Michael than strict necessity required, watching his hands move across the keyboard with quiet, focused patience. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure." "Why did you stop this morning? You were just delivering a part next door. Nobody would have blamed you for walking past and minding your own business. You've got..." She glanced briefly at the toolbox resting near his feet. "A business of your own to run, I'd imagine. Clients waiting on you." Michael's hands paused for just a moment before resuming their work. "I heard one of your techs say the aircraft panics when you try to start it," he said. That word stuck with me. My father used to describe machines that way sometimes, and it always meant something specific to him. A system that isn't broken, just scared of information it doesn't trust. When I heard that phrase, something in the back of my head lit up, and I couldn't walk away from it. Simple as that. "That's not simple," Victoria said. "That's instinct built over years of experience. Most people wouldn't have made that connection in 100 years, let alone from 40 yards away overhearing half a sentence." Michael allowed himself a small, tired smile. My father spent his whole life building that instinct into me, one small correction at a time. I didn't earn it in 100 years. He earned most of it. I just carried it forward." Victoria was quiet for a moment, watching him work. "You said you have a daughter." Michael's hand stilled completely this time. He looked up surprised. "How did you—" "Priya mentioned it when she was checking your background before I agreed to see you. 8 years old, I believe." Something shifted in Michael's expression. Not defensive exactly, but protective, the way any parent's face changes slightly whenever a stranger references their child. "Lily," he said. "Yes. 8 years old and smarter than most adults I know." "Is her mother—" "She passed away when Lily was 2, Michael said quietly before Victoria had to finish the question. "Complications during a routine surgery. It's just been the 2 of us since." "I'm sorry," Victoria said again, and this time there was something different in her voice, something that had cracked open slightly around the edges of her usual composure. "Thank you," Michael said. "It's been 6 years. Some days are still harder than others, but Lily makes it easier than it would be otherwise. She's got a way of reminding me why I keep showing up even on the days I'd rather not." Victoria looked at him for a long moment, and something in her expression suggested she was recalculating something not about the aircraft, but about the man sitting in front of it. "You could have taken a corporate job," she said. "With your background, your experience, any of the major maintenance conglomerates would have hired you in a heartbeat. Steady salary, benefits. None of the uncertainty of running your own shop. I thought about it," Michael admitted. "After Sarah passed, actually. I had an offer from a company 2 states over. Good money. Stable hours." He shook his head slightly. "But it would have meant relocating, pulling Lily away from the only home she'd ever known, right after she'd already lost her mother. I couldn't do that to her. So I kept the shop instead, kept us close to family, kept things as steady as I could manage." "Even though it's been struggling," Victoria said. It wasn't a question. Something in his voice, in the careful way he'd described his business earlier, had told her enough. Michael didn't deny it. "Big companies moved into the area a couple years back. Undercut guys like me on price, promised faster turnaround times. Most of my longtime clients switched over. Can't really blame them, everyone's trying to save money where they can." He shrugged a small, tired gesture. "I get by. Some months are tighter than others, but Lily's never gone without anything she's needed. That's what matters." Victoria said nothing for a long moment, watching him turn back to the screen, watching the quiet, unglamorous dignity of a man who had built an entire life around showing up for someone smaller than himself day after day, without ever once demanding recognition for it. "Almost there," Michael said, finally breaking the silence. Rebuilding the last section of the file now. Dennis, who had been watching from a few feet away, stepped closer again. His earlier skepticism now fully replaced by something closer to quiet awe. "You're really doing this," he murmured. "You're actually about to fix an aircraft that beat every specialist we brought in." "Don't count anything yet," Michael said. "I've been wrong before. Won't know for certain until we try to bring the engines online." "But you think it'll work?" Michael glanced up at him. "I think the aircraft's been telling us the truth this whole time. We just weren't listening to the right part of what it was saying." The final few minutes stretched out in a way that felt almost unbearable to everyone gathered in the hangar. Michael worked in near total silence, occasionally murmuring something to himself, occasionally pausing to double-check a value against the aircraft's technical documentation spread open on a small table beside him. Victoria stood close enough to watch every keystroke, though she said nothing more, allowing him the space to finish what he'd started. Around them, the crowd of employees had grown larger still, nearly 50 people, now technicians and administrative staff alike, drawn by the same current of quiet hope that had pulled Dennis and Victoria closer over the past hour. Someone near the back was recording on their phone, though, whether for personal memory or something they intended to share later. Nobody seemed to mind enough to stop them. "Okay," Michael said finally, sitting back slightly. "Files rebuilt. I've pushed the corrected version into the startup sequence. Next step is running the initialization protocol again from the beginning and seeing whether the 2 navigation systems actually agree this time. Dennis stepped forward. "You want me to run it or—" "Go ahead," Michael said, standing up from the stool to give Dennis room at the terminal. "It's your aircraft. You should be the one to run the test." Dennis hesitated for just a moment, clearly surprised by the gesture, before nodding and taking Michael's place at the keyboard. He typed a short sequence of commands, and the screen flickered, cycling through the same startup sequence that had failed again and again for 6 consecutive days. The hangar went completely silent. Victoria's hands crossed over her chest, tightened almost imperceptibly. Michael stood a few feet back, arms loose at his sides, his expression calm, but focused, the same expression Dennis imagined he probably wore in the field years ago, waiting to see whether a repair held under pressure that actually mattered. The screen cycled through system checks: Navigation 1, Navigation 2, Synchronization handshake. For one agonizing second, nothing happened. Then a small green indicator appeared on the screen. Synchronization confirmed. A quiet gasp rippled through the crowd. "Keep going," Michael said softly. "That's just the first check." Dennis's hands were visibly shaking now as he continued through the sequence: fuel system check green, electrical systems green, flight control surfaces green. One by one, every system that had refused to cooperate for 6 straight days confirmed itself operational, clean, ready. And then finally, the last line of the sequence appeared on the screen. "Engine start, authorization granted." The hangar erupted. Not immediately, for 1 full second. Everyone simply stared at the screen as though afraid that looking away or breathing too loudly might undo whatever miracle had just occurred. And then all at once, the silence broke into something Victoria would remember for the rest of her life. A wave of sound gasps and disbelieving laughter, and someone near the back actually crying unashamed in front of 50 of their coworkers. Dennis turned to Michael, his face open in a way Michael hadn't seen from him all day. "Do it," he said. "Start the engines. I want to hear it." Michael shook his head. "It's not my aircraft to start." He looked at Victoria instead. Victoria stared at him for a long moment, something enormous and complicated moving behind her eyes. 6 days of fear and exhaustion and public humiliation, all of it suddenly balanced on the edge of a single decision. "Do it," she said quietly to Dennis, though her eyes never left Michael's face. "Start the engines." Dennis's hands moved across the controls with the reverent care of a man performing a ritual he'd feared he'd never get to complete. The hangar held its breath. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, deep within the aircraft, a low hum began to build, quiet, at first almost hesitant, and then rising steadily, unmistakably, into the powerful resonant roar of jet engines, coming fully to life for the first time in 6 days. The sound rolled through the hangar like something physical shaking the air itself, and Victoria felt it move through her chest exactly the way she remembered feeling the very first time her father had ever taken her onto a tarmac as a little girl decades ago. Before any of this, the company, the pressure, the endless proving of herself had ever existed. 50 people stood in that hangar and watched an $80 million aircraft come back to life, and every single one of them turned almost involuntarily toward the quiet man in the faded work jacket standing near the terminal. His expression not triumphant, not proud in any performative way, just quietly, deeply relieved. Victoria walked toward him slowly, the roar of the engine still filling the space around them, until she was standing close enough that she didn't have to raise her voice to be heard. "Who taught you how to find that?" she asked. Michael looked at her, and for just a moment, something vulnerable passed across his face. Grief and pride tangled together in a way that only people who've lost someone they love deeply ever really understand. "My father," he said simply. Victoria nodded slowly, and behind her, the entire hangar erupted into applause. Technicians who had failed for 6 days. Engineers who had flown in from across the world. Ordinary employees who had simply watched a company they cared about hold its breath for nearly a week, all of them clapping, some of them crying, none of them able to look away from the quiet single father who had walked in that morning only to deliver a repaired navigation unit and somehow ended up rewriting the entire story. Michael stood in the middle of it, overwhelmed, unsteady thinking, not of the $3 million waiting for him. Not of the cameras already gathering outside the hangar doors, but of a small girl 4 blocks from an elementary school waiting for her father to come home and finish a lighthouse puzzle he had promised her the night before. He had no idea, standing there in the roar of those engines, that the hardest decision of his entire life was still waiting for him, not in that hangar, but the very next morning, when Victoria Harrington would offer him everything he had ever struggled for, and he would have to decide whether taking it was really the right thing to do at all. The applause in the hangar didn't fade so much as it slowly transformed into something else. People embracing each other. Technicians who had barely spoken in 6 days, suddenly laughing together. A few of the older engineers standing off to the side, wiping their eyes and pretending they weren't. Michael stood at the center of it all. The roar of the engines still settling into a steady, healthy hum behind him, and felt strangely disconnected from the celebration. The way a person sometimes feels disconnected from their own reflection in a mirror they weren't expecting to look into. Victoria didn't join the celebration either. She stood a few feet from him, watching her own employees hug each other with an expression Michael couldn't quite read. Relief certainly, but something more complicated underneath it. Something that looked almost like grief for the 6 days she'd just lived through. "Ms. Harrington?" Dennis said, appearing at her side, his voice still slightly unsteady. "Every system's reading green. Fuel flow's stable. We've got full engine response across both turbines. I want to run a complete diagnostic cycle before anyone even thinks about scheduling a flight, but—" He shook his head, still visibly stunned. "By every measure we have, this aircraft is fully operational." "Do it," Victoria said. "Full diagnostic. I want every system checked twice before I sign off on anything." "Understood." Dennis hesitated, glancing toward Michael. "Should I have him stay, in case something comes up during the diagnostic that needs—" "I'll stay," Michael said before Victoria could answer. "Long as you need me to. I want to see this through properly, not just walk away the second the engines turned over." Victoria studied him for a moment, something behind her eyes shifting slightly, recalibrating. "You don't have somewhere else to be." Michael glanced at his watch, and something crossed his face, a flicker of quiet worry that he quickly smoothed over. "I've got someone waiting on me tonight," he said. "But I told her I'd be home late, and she's used to that, unfortunately, more than I'd like." He paused. "I'll stay until the diagnostic's done. After that, I really do need to head back." Victoria nodded slowly. "Dennis, run the diagnostic. I need to make a call." She glanced once more at Michael, something unreadable passing behind her eyes, and then turned and walked briskly toward the side door, already pulling her phone from her jacket pocket. Michael watched her go, then turned back toward the aircraft, toward Dennis, toward the small crowd of technicians still gathered nearby, some of them beginning to approach him now with the kind of tentative, awkward respect that came from people who had spent 6 days failing at something and were still working out how to feel about someone else's success. A young engineer, the same woman who had spoken up earlier about the aircraft's failure not being documented in any manual, approached him hesitantly, tablet still clutched to her chest. "Mr. Carter," she said, "can I ask you something?" "Sure." "How long have you been doing this repair work, I mean? Independently?" 6 years on my own, 12 before that in the Army." She nodded slowly, glancing back toward the aircraft, toward the diagnostic terminal Dennis was already working through with 2 other technicians. "I have an engineering degree from Georgia Tech," she said. "Top of my program. I've been working here for 3 years and I couldn't find what you found in 8 minutes. Michael saw something vulnerable in her expression. Not resentment, but a kind of quiet reckoning, the sort that happens when a young person's understanding of expertise gets rearranged all at once. "It's not about the degree," he said gently. "You've got knowledge I don't have. I couldn't tell you half of what's in those textbooks you studied. I just had a different kind of experience, and it happened to line up with what this particular problem needed. Different day, different problem, you'd probably be the one finding the answer in 8 minutes while I stood around scratching my head." "You really believe that?" "I do," Michael said, and he meant it. "My father used to tell me there's no such thing as one kind of smart. There's just different tools for different jobs, and the trick is knowing which tool you're holding and which one you actually need. Sometimes the fanciest tool in the box isn't the right one for the problem in front of you." The young engineer studied him for a moment longer, something in her expression softening into something that looked almost like hope. Would you ever consider training people, teaching, I mean? Not classroom stuff, just whatever it is you do. However you think about problems. Michael smiled, tired but genuine. Nobody's ever asked me that before. Well, she said, I'm asking. Before Michael could answer, the side door swung open again and Victoria strode back into the hangar, her phone still in hand. Her expression carrying something new, a kind of decisive energy that hadn't been there 10 minutes earlier. Mr. Carter, she called out. A moment, please. Michael excused himself from the young engineer and crossed the hangar toward her. Up close, he could see that whatever call she'd just made had shifted something in her. The tightness around her eyes had eased slightly, replaced by a focused, almost hungry kind of energy. I've spoken with my board, she said. Informally, but enough to get a sense of where things stand. The story's already breaking outside this hangar. Reporters are asking for details. I intend to hold a follow-up press conference tomorrow morning, and I intend for you to be standing beside me when I do. Michael blinked, caught off guard. Ms. Harrington, I appreciate that, but I really don't need... You solved a problem that defeated every specialist in this industry, Victoria said, cutting him off not unkindly, but firmly. The world is going to want to know who you are, Mr. Carter, whether either of us likes it or not. I'd rather control that story than let it control us. And frankly, she added softer now, I think you deserve to be recognized properly, not just handed a check in private and sent on your way. Michael was quiet for a moment, turning the offer over in his mind. He thought about Lily, about what it might mean for her to see her father's face on the news, about what $3 million could actually do. For the two of them, pay off the shop's debts, fix the truck, put money away for her college, buy her the kind of stability he'd been chasing unsuccessfully for 6 years. All right, he said finally, tomorrow morning. But Ms. Harrington, he hesitated. I need to be honest with you about something first. Victoria's expression sharpened, slightly wary. What is it? I don't know yet what I'm going to do about the money. For a moment, Victoria looked genuinely confused, as though he'd spoken a sentence in a language she didn't fully understand. You don't know what you're going to do about $3 million. No, ma'am. Mr. Carter, that's not a small thing to be uncertain about. I know, Michael said quietly. Believe me, I know exactly how much that money could change my life and my daughter's life. I've thought about it every single hour since your assistant told me the amount you'd offered. But something's sitting wrong with me about it, and I haven't figured out what yet. I don't want to stand up in front of cameras tomorrow and say something I haven't actually thought through. Victoria studied him for a long, searching moment. In 11 years of running Harrington Aerospace, she had negotiated with billionaires, fought off hostile board members, and stared down journalists, trying to bait her into career-ending statements. She had never once encountered someone hesitating over the acceptance of $3 million. Take the night, she said finally. Think it through. Whatever you decide, I'll respect it. But Mr. Carter... Her voice softened slightly. For whatever it's worth, I don't think there's a wrong answer here. I just want you to be certain, whatever you choose. Michael nodded, something in his chest loosening slightly at her willingness to give him the space. Thank you. Go home, Victoria said. Be with your daughter. We'll finish the diagnostic tonight, and I'll see you here tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock sharp. The drive home felt longer than usual, though the roads were the same roads Michael drove every single day. He kept both hands on the wheel, his mind circling the same question over and over, unable to settle on an answer that felt entirely right. $3 million. He thought about his father's old shop, the one Robert Carter had run out of their garage for decades. Never wealthy, never comfortable in the way wealthy people were comfortable, but always steady. Always enough. His father had turned down more than one opportunity over the years to work for larger, better-paying companies, always for the same reason, a stubborn, quiet belief that some things mattered more than money, and that a man who chased every dollar eventually lost track of what he was chasing it for in the first place. Michael had never fully understood that belief until tonight, sitting in traffic with 3 million reasons to question it. He pulled into his driveway a little after 8 later than he'd promised and found the porch light already on, casting a warm yellow glow across the small front yard. Through the window, he could see his neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, sitting on the couch with Lily, the two of them bent over what looked like a half-finished lighthouse puzzle. He let himself in quietly, and Lily's head shot up the instant the door opened. "Dad!" She scrambled off the couch and crossed the room in 3 quick steps, wrapping her arms around his waist, before he'd even had a chance to close the door behind him. "You're late. Mrs. Alvarez said you had a big job today." "I did have a big job today," Michael said, kneeling down to her level, brushing a strand of hair away from her face. "A really big one, actually." Mrs. Alvarez rose from the couch, gathering her purse. "I saw it on the news, Michael," she said, her voice warm with something that sounded almost like pride. "The aircraft, the CEO, the $3 million that was you on the television. They were saying somebody unexpected fixed it, but they didn't have a name yet." Michael felt his stomach tighten slightly. "That was me," he admitted. Mrs. Alvarez's eyes widened. "Michael, $3 million. It's complicated," he said, glancing down at Lily, who was staring up at him with wide, curious eyes, clearly trying to piece together the significance of what the adults around her were discussing. "Dad, are we rich now?" Lily asked the question so direct and unguarded that Michael couldn't help but laugh softly, despite everything weighing on him. "I don't know yet, baby girl," he said honestly. "I haven't decided what to do about the money." Mrs. Alvarez said her goodbyes, promising to check the news for more details, and let herself out, leaving Michael alone with his daughter in the quiet of their small living room, the half-finished lighthouse puzzle still spread across the coffee table. "Come on," Michael said, sitting down on the floor beside the puzzle. "Let's finish this. You promised me the lighthouse tonight, and I'm a man of my word even on a day like today." Lily settled down beside him, picking up a puzzle piece and studying it carefully before fitting it into place. For a few minutes, they worked in comfortable silence, the kind of silence Michael had always treasured, with her no pressure to fill the air with words, just the simple, steady comfort of being together. "Dad," Lily said eventually, not looking up from the puzzle, "what's complicated about it, the money?" Michael considered the question carefully before answering. His daughter had a way of asking things so plainly that it forced him to actually examine what he believed rather than hiding behind vague adult reassurances. "You remember Grandpa's notebook?" he asked. "The one I keep in the truck. The one with all his handwriting in it. The one you always say helped you fix things." "That's the one." Michael picked up a puzzle piece, turning it over in his fingers without placing it. "Grandpa used to tell me that knowledge isn't really something you're supposed to keep for yourself. He believed the whole point of learning something is eventually passing it forward to somebody else who needs it. And I keep thinking about that tonight because—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Because today, I used everything Grandpa ever taught me to fix a problem that a whole company full of very smart, very educated people couldn't solve. And now they want to give me $3 million for it. That's good though, right?" Lily's brow furrowed slightly. "It could be," Michael said. "It would mean we'd never have to worry about money again. I could fix up the shop, buy you anything you needed, put money aside for when you're older and want to go to college. It would change everything for us." "But," Michael smiled slightly at how quickly she'd caught the hesitation in his voice. "But I keep thinking about all the kids out there who grew up like me. Kids who love working with their hands, who are good at figuring out how things work, but who never got the chance to learn the way I got to learn from Grandpa. Kids who don't have anybody to hand them a notebook full of 40 years of hard-earned lessons." He set the puzzle piece down. "I keep wondering if there's something better I could do with this than just keeping it for us." Lily was quiet for a long moment, studying her father's face with the kind of serious, unblinking attention only children seem capable of. "Like Grandpa's note said," she said finally, "about passing it on." Michael looked at her, something tightening in his throat. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Exactly like that." "Then I think you already know what you're gonna do," Lily said, matter of fact, the way only an 8-year-old could deliver something so profound without any awareness of its weight. She picked up another puzzle piece and fit it neatly into place. "This piece goes here, by the way. You've been holding it wrong the whole time." Michael laughed a real laugh, the tension in his chest easing slightly for the first time since he'd sat down in Victoria Harrington's office that afternoon. He looked at the puzzle piece in Lily's small hands, then back at her face, and felt something settle inside him. Not a complete answer yet, but the beginning of one. The shape of a decision slowly forming out of the fog of an impossible day. They finished the lighthouse together. An hour later, the two of them sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, the final piece clicking into place with a small, satisfying sound. Lily beamed at the completed image, a tall white lighthouse standing against a stormy gray sea, its beam cutting through the darkness toward a small distant ship. "We did it," she said proudly. Michael looked at the finished puzzle for a long moment, at the small beam of light cutting through the storm, guiding something safely home, and thought about his father, about the notebook sitting in his truck, about 30 struggling technicians, and one determined young engineer who'd asked him without any prompting whether he'd ever consider teaching. "Yeah," he said quietly, "we did." He tucked Lily into bed 20 minutes later, the way he did every night, sitting on the edge of her small bed while she settled beneath her blankets, her eyes already heavy with sleep. "Dad," she murmured, half asleep already, "whatever you decide about the money, I think Grandpa would be proud of you either way." Michael leaned down and kissed her forehead. "Good night, baby girl." "Night, Dad." He sat with her a few minutes longer, watching her breathing slow into the steady rhythm of sleep, and then made his way quietly out to the kitchen, where he sat alone at the small table with a cup of coffee going cold in front of him and his father's notebook open beside it. He turned the worn pages slowly past decades of handwritten notes on engines and circuits and diagnostic procedures until he reached a page near the back that he had read more times than he could count, a page where his father, in his careful, deliberate handwriting, had written something Michael hadn't fully understood until years after his father was gone. The hardest part of this work was never the machine's son. It was watching talented young men and women get turned away from opportunities because they didn't have the right last name or the right connections. "If I could change one thing about this industry before I go, it would be that. Fix that, and you'll fix more than any engine ever could." Michael sat with those words for a long time that night. The kitchen quiet around him, his coffee growing cold, his decision slowly settling into place with the same quiet certainty he'd felt 8 minutes into diagnosing an aircraft that had defeated the best minds in the country. The morning of the press conference arrived cold and clear, the sky over the airfield, a hard, bright blue that made everything below it look sharper, more consequential. Michael stood near the side of the small podium that had been set up outside Hangar 7, his father's notebook tucked into the inner pocket of his jacket, watching the same crowd of reporters who had gathered a week earlier, now pressed even more tightly against the barriers, drawn by a story that had gone from corporate embarrassment to something closer to a modern parable. Victoria appeared beside him a few minutes before the conference began, dressed in the same kind of sharp-tailored suit she always wore, though something in her posture this morning seemed less armored than it had a week ago. "Ready?" she asked. "Not even a little bit," Michael admitted. She almost smiled. "You'll be fine. Just answer honestly. That's all anyone out there really wants, even if they don't realize it." "Ms. Harrington," Michael said before they stepped up to the podium, "I've made my decision. About the money." Victoria turned to face him fully, her expression carefully neutral, though Michael could see the curiosity she was working hard to suppress. "And I'm not taking it," Michael said. "Not the way it was offered." Whatever Victoria had expected him to say, it clearly wasn't that. Her eyebrows rose slightly, and for a moment she simply studied him, searching his face for some sign that he was joking or hedging or setting up some kind of negotiation. She found none of those things. Just quiet, unwavering certainty. You fixed an $80 million aircraft that an entire industry couldn't touch, she said slowly. You're standing here telling me you don't want the $3 million I publicly promised. I'm telling you, I don't want it as a personal reward, Michael clarified. I want to talk to you about something different, something I think matters more. Around them, the press conference organizers were signaling that it was nearly time to begin. Reporters shifting restlessly, cameras adjusting focus, the entire apparatus of public attention winding tighter with every passing second. We don't exactly have time for a lengthy negotiation right now, Victoria said, though there was no irritation in her voice, only genuine curiosity, sharp and immediate. I know, Michael said. I'm not asking you to decide anything right this second. I'm just asking you to hear me out after this is over. Give me 20 minutes in private before you make any public commitment about what happens with that money. Victoria studied him a moment longer and then slowly nodded. All right, Mr. Carter. 20 minutes, after the cameras are gone. They stepped up to the podium together a few minutes later, and the crowd of reporters surged forward almost as one, a wall of raised phones and shouted questions crashing against the barrier the moment Victoria opened her mouth to speak. Thank you all for coming. She began, her voice carrying easily across the tarmac, steady and composed in a way that gave no hint of the private conversation that had just taken place moments earlier. 1 week ago, I stood in this same spot and told you that our aircraft was broken and that I was offering $3 million to anyone who could fix it. Today I'm standing here to tell you that our aircraft is fixed, fully operational, and cleared for flight as of last night's completed diagnostic. A wave of applause and shouted follow-up questions rippled through the crowd. Victoria held up a hand, waiting for quiet before continuing. The man responsible for that repair is standing beside me. His name is Michael Carter. He is not affiliated with any major aviation corporation. He does not hold an engineering degree from a prestigious university. He owns a small, independent avionics repair shop, and he is a single father raising his 8-year-old daughter. She paused, letting that information settle across the crowd. He walked into Hangar 7 yesterday morning to deliver an unrelated repair to a different aircraft. He overheard a conversation about our jet's failure, asked to take a look, and within roughly 8 minutes identified a problem that a dozen of the most qualified specialists in this industry, myself included, through my own engineering team, had spent 6 days failing to find. Reporters shouted over each other, questions colliding into an unintelligible wall of noise, until Victoria raised her hand again, quieting them. Mr. Carter, she said, turning slightly toward him. Would you like to say anything? Michael stepped forward, his heart pounding harder than it had at any point during the actual repair, and looked out over the sea of cameras and microphones with a steadiness he didn't entirely feel. I just want to say, he began, his voice a little rough at first before steadying, that what I did yesterday wasn't magic, and it wasn't some special genius that other people don't have. It was something my father taught me over years of working alongside him, and I was lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time, with the right piece of knowledge in my head to notice something everyone else had missed. That's all it was. A reporter near the front called out, Mr. Carter, is it true you're refusing the $3 million reward? Michael glanced briefly at Victoria, who gave the smallest, almost imperceptible nod, granting him permission to answer honestly. I haven't refused anything outright, Michael said carefully. I've asked Ms. Harrington for a private conversation about what happens with that money because I believe there might be a way to use it that matters more than a personal check. But that's a conversation between the two of us, and I'd rather not get ahead of it in front of all of you. The crowd erupted into a fresh wave of shouted questions, but Victoria stepped forward smoothly, redirecting attention with the practiced ease of someone who had spent 11 years learning exactly how to manage a room full of reporters. That concludes what we're prepared to share today, she said. We'll issue a formal statement once further details are finalized. Thank you all for your time. She turned and walked briskly toward the side door of the hangar, and Michael followed close behind, the shouted questions of the press fading gradually behind them as the heavy door swung shut, sealing them into the relative quiet of the hangar's interior. Chib. They ended up in Victoria's office, the same room where Michael had first stood the day before. though something about the space felt different now, less like a courtroom, more like neutral ground. Victoria settled behind her desk, gesturing for Michael to take the chair across from her. "All right, Mr. Carter," she said. "You have my full attention. What is it you want to propose?" Michael reached into his jacket and pulled out his father's notebook, setting it gently on the desk between them, the leather cover worn soft and pale in places from decades of handling. "This belonged to my father," he said. 40 years of everything he learned about aviation repair written down in his own hand, because he never trusted that the official manuals told the whole truth. He spent his entire career watching talented people get turned away from this industry, not because they weren't capable, but because they didn't have the right last name, the right connections, the right zip code. He used to say that was the real failure of this industry. Not the machines, the people it left behind. Victoria listened without interrupting, her eyes moving between Michael's face and the worn notebook sitting on her desk. "I don't want $3 million for myself," Michael continued. "I want you to use that money to build something. A real training program, not a scholarship that helps one or two lucky kids, but something bigger. Something that takes young people from struggling neighborhoods, kids who are good with their hands, kids who think the way I think, and actually teaches them this industry from the ground up. Real certifications, real mentorship, real jobs waiting for them at the end of it, not just a diploma and a pat on the back." Victoria was quiet for a long moment, studying him with an intensity that made Michael wonder if he'd overstepped, if the offer sounded naive or impractical coming from a man who ran a struggling shop out of a small garage. "You understand what you're describing would require significant infrastructure," she said finally. "Facilities, instructors, ongoing funding beyond the initial $3 million. This isn't a one-time gesture, Mr. Carter. This is a long-term commitment." "I understand that," Michael said. "I'm not asking you to do it lightly. I'm asking because I think you're one of the few people with the resources and the platform to actually make it real instead of just talking about it." Victoria leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping slowly against the armrest, working through calculations Michael couldn't fully follow, cost projections, board approvals, logistical hurdles that came with building something from nothing. "You realize this benefits my company too," she said eventually, her tone carefully measured. "Positive press, goodwill, a pipeline of trained technicians we could eventually hire ourselves. I don't want you to think I'm agreeing to this purely out of altruism." "I don't need you to be purely altruistic," Michael said. "I just need you to actually build it and build it right. I don't care what your reasons are as long as the kids who come through that program get a real shot at something better." Something shifted in Victoria's expression. Then a kind of respect Michael hadn't seen from her before. Not admiration exactly, but recognition. The look of one person realizing that another person had thought this through far more carefully than they'd expected. "And you," she said, "what's your role in all this? You understand, I'm not simply going to write a check and walk away. If we're building something like this, it needs someone who actually understands the work, someone the students can trust and learn from directly. Someone who isn't just a name on a plaque." Michael hesitated. He hadn't fully considered this part of it. Not really. He'd been so focused on the idea itself that he hadn't stopped to think about what it might mean for his own life, his own shop, his own daughter. "I have a business to run," he said slowly. "A daughter to raise. I can't just walk away from either of those things." "I'm not asking you to walk away from anything," Victoria said. "I'm asking whether you'd be willing to help build it. Design the curriculum. Teach at least part-time, alongside whatever specialists we bring in. You clearly have something most instructors don't. The ability to explain complex problems in a way that actually makes sense to people who haven't spent a decade in a classroom." Michael thought about the young engineer from the day before, the one who had asked him unprompted whether he'd ever consider teaching. He thought about his father's notebook, about the years Robert Carter had spent quietly training Michael, without either of them ever calling it that. Just a father and son working side by side in a garage, one generation passing something forward to the next, without ever needing to name what was happening. "I'd want to keep my shop," Michael said finally. "It's not much, but it's mine, and it's steady, even if it's not thriving. I don't want to give that up entirely." You wouldn't have to, Victoria said. We could structure it, however makes sense, part-time instruction a few days a week, whatever fits around your existing commitments. This isn't about taking anything away from you, Mr. Carter. It's about building something new alongside what you already have. Michael sat with that for a long moment, looking down at his father's notebook resting on the desk between them, thinking about Lily, about the lighthouse puzzle, about a beam of light cutting through a storm to guide something safely home. All right, he said finally. I'm in, but I want to be clear about something, Ms. Harrington. Go ahead. This can't just be a name on a building. It can't just be a press release and a ribbon-cutting ceremony and then quietly forgotten in a year once the story stops being useful to your company. If we're doing this, we're doing it for real, for years, and it needs to actually change lives, not just headlines. Victoria met his gaze steadily, something firm and unwavering settling into her expression. Mr. Carter, I built this company from a struggling regional charter service into one of the most respected private aviation firms in the country. I did not do that by starting things I didn't intend to finish. She extended her hand across the desk. You have my word. We build it for real, and we build it to last. Michael studied her hand for a moment, and then reached out and shook it, the same steady, deliberate grip he used on every repair he'd ever completed, every promise he'd ever made. Then we've got a deal, he said. Victoria smiled a real smile this time. Unguarded, the first one Michael had seen from her since he'd walked into her office the day before. The $3 million becomes the foundation, she said. Not a reward, an investment. I'll have my legal team draft the framework this week, and I want you involved in every decision from the ground-up curriculum admissions criteria, everything. There's one more thing, Michael said. What's that? I want it named after my father. Not after me, after him. He rested his hand briefly on the worn cover of the notebook. Everything I know came from him. It's only right that his name is the one attached to it, not mine. Victoria looked at the notebook, then at Michael, something soft and genuine passing across her face. The Carter Aviation Training Initiative, she said quietly, testing the words. I think that sounds exactly right. Michael nodded, something settling deep in his chest, a quiet, steady certainty that felt for the first time in a very long while like he had finally found a way to turn everything his father had taught him into something bigger than either of them had ever managed alone. Neither of them knew yet, sitting in that office with the worn notebook between them, just how far that decision would eventually travel, how many young lives it would touch, how many struggling families it would change, or how much Michael Carter's quiet, unglamorous choice that morning would come to mean to people neither of them had ever met. But for now, it was enough that the deal was made. The handshake was real, and somewhere out on the tarmac, an $80 million aircraft sat fully repaired, waiting patiently for its next flight. A small, unremarkable symbol of a much larger truth neither of them had fully understood yet. That sometimes the most important repairs a person ever makes have nothing to do with engines at all. The story broke wide open within 48 hours, and by the end of that week, Michael Carter's name had traveled further than he ever could have imagined, standing in his small garage 6 years earlier, wondering how he was going to make rent. Morning shows called, podcasts called. A national magazine wanted to run a feature titled The Repairman Who Refused $3 million. And Michael turned down every single one of them, except a short, careful statement. Victoria's communications team helped him prepare because the last thing he wanted was for Lily to open her tablet at school and find her father's face plastered across headlines he hadn't approved. What he couldn't turn down, though, was the work. Building something real, something that actually lasted, turned out to be nothing like the quiet, focused clarity of diagnosing a corrupted file at 2 in the afternoon with 50 people watching. It was slower, messier, full of meetings that stretched for hours, legal documents that took days to draft, and disagreements that Michael hadn't expected to find himself in the middle of. The first real conflict came 3 weeks after the handshake in Victoria's office, in a conference room on the top floor of Harrington Aerospace's headquarters, where Michael sat at the far end of a long glass table, surrounded by people in suits far more expensive than anything he owned. I want to be direct about my concerns," said a board member named Richard Ashford, an older man with silver hair and the kind of confident, unhurried voice that came from decades of never having to raise it to be heard. "We are proposing to spend $3 million company funds, technically, even if publicly framed as a personal reward-turned-donation on a training program with no established curriculum, no accredited partnership, and no proven track record. I understand the sentiment behind this, Victoria, truly. But sentiment isn't a business plan." Victoria sat at the head of the table, her expression composed but firm. "The sentiment, as you call it, generated more positive press coverage in 1 week than our marketing department has produced in the last 3 years combined, Richard. That has tangible value." "Press coverage fades," Richard said. "What doesn't fade is a $3 million line item with no clear return on investment." Michael felt the eyes of half the room shift toward him, and he understood in that moment that this wasn't really a conversation about numbers. It was a conversation about whether he belonged in this room at all. "May I say something?" he asked. Richard gestured toward him with a thin, permissive nod, the kind of gesture a person makes when they're humoring someone rather than genuinely inviting them to speak. "I understand this looks like a risk on paper," Michael said, keeping his voice steady, refusing to let the discomfort of the room shrink him the way it wanted to. "I'm not a businessman. I don't have projections or spreadsheets to show you. What I have is 12 years of watching young soldiers come through avionics training with nothing but raw talent and no direction, and I watched half of them get lost because nobody gave them a real path forward. And I've spent 6 years running my own shop, watching capable young people in my own neighborhood take jobs stacking shelves, because nobody ever told them a career like mine was even possible for someone like them." He paused, glancing around the table, meeting each set of skeptical eyes one at a time. "You're right that this isn't a proven business model yet," he continued. "But neither was Harrington Aerospace once. Somebody took a risk on this company a long time ago before it was the name it is today. I'm asking you to take a similar risk on people instead of just an aircraft fleet." The room was quiet for a moment. Richard studied Michael with an expression that had shifted almost imperceptibly from dismissive to something more contemplative. "That's a fair point," he said eventually, though his voice carried no full surrender. "But points don't build accredited curriculums. Mr. Carter, passion doesn't satisfy insurance liability requirements when you're putting untrained teenagers around aircraft components." "Then let's solve that," Victoria said, cutting in smoothly. "I'm not asking the board to approve an undefined idea. I'm asking for authorization to move forward with formal planning partnership discussions with a technical college for accreditation. A structured safety protocol developed alongside our own compliance team. A pilot cohort of no more than 20 students to prove the concept before we scale anything further. Give us 6 months to build the actual framework. If it doesn't meet rigorous standards, I won't ask you to fund a second year." Richard exchanged a glance with 2 other board members. Michael didn't recognize some silent negotiation passing between them that Michael couldn't fully read. 6 months, Richard said finally. A pilot program. 20 students properly vetted, properly insured with accreditation partnerships in place before a single student sets foot near a real aircraft. If it works, we discuss expansion. If it doesn't, it'll work. Michael said quieter than he meant to, but firm enough that it carried across the table. Richard studied him a moment longer, something unreadable in his expression, and then gave a short, decisive nod. 6 months, he repeated. Prove it. The 6 months that followed were in some ways harder than the 8 minutes Michael had spent diagnosing the jet. There was no single corrupted file to find this time, no clean, satisfying moment where a green light confirmed he'd been right. There was only the slow, grinding work of building something from nothing, meetings with a local technical college about accreditation standards, safety protocols drafted and redrafted a dozen times, a curriculum that Michael sketched out by hand on legal pads late at night after Lily had gone to bed, drawing on everything his father had ever taught him, and translating it into something a 16-year-old with no prior experience could actually follow. He kept his shop open the entire time, splitting his days between customers who needed their navigation units repaired and long evenings spent hunched over curriculum drafts at his kitchen table, his father's notebook always within arm's reach. Lily noticed the change before he did. "You're tired all the time now," she said one evening, watching him rub his eyes over a stack of paperwork spread across the table. "You used to finish puzzles with me every night. Now you barely finish dinner before you're back to writing stuff." Michael set his pen down, guilt settling heavy in his chest. "You're right," he said. "I'm sorry, baby girl. I've been letting the program take up more of my time than it should." "I'm not mad," Lily said, climbing into the chair beside him. "I just miss you, that's all." "Is it worth it, though? All this extra work?" Michael looked at the curriculum draft in front of him. Pages of careful notes about diagnostic thinking, about troubleshooting philosophy, about the same lessons his father had spent 40 years teaching him, one small correction at a time. "I think it might be one of the most important things I ever do," he said honestly. "But you're important too, and I need to find a better balance, starting tonight." He closed the folder, set it aside, and spent the rest of the evening finishing a puzzle with her, instead, a smaller one. This time, a farmhouse in autumn, but no less precious for its size. The following week, Michael restructured his schedule, blocking off 2 evenings and every Sunday afternoon as untouchable family time. No exceptions, no matter how urgent the program's demands seemed. It slowed his progress on the curriculum slightly, but it steadied something in him that had begun quietly to fray. Not everyone within Harrington Aerospace was as easily won over as Richard Ashford had eventually become. Dennis Cole, despite his growing respect for Michael's abilities, struggled privately with a different kind of discomfort, one he finally voiced to Victoria nearly 2 months into the pilot program's development. "I want to be careful how I say this," Dennis said, standing in Victoria's office with his arms crossed, "because I don't want it to sound like I'm against Michael personally. I'm not. What he did with that aircraft was extraordinary, and I've said as much to anyone who'll listen." "But," Victoria said, recognizing the shape of the sentence before he finished it. "But I've spent 26 years building expertise in this field," Dennis said. "Formal education certifications, decades of hands-on experience. And there's a part of me, I'm not proud of this, but I want to be honest. There's a part of me that feels like this whole narrative has quietly implied that all of that doesn't matter as much as I thought it did. Like anyone with a wrench and good instincts can walk in off the street and outperform people who spent their whole careers earning their credentials." Victoria considered his words carefully before responding. "Do you actually believe that's what happened here, Dennis? That credentials don't matter?" "No," Dennis admitted. "Logically, no. I know what he found took real skill, real experience. I know it wasn't luck, but logic and feeling aren't always the same thing. And I'd be lying if I said this hasn't stung a little, watching a man without a single certification succeed where an entire team of us failed." Victoria was quiet for a moment, choosing her next words with unusual care. "I think you're allowing your pride to distort the actual lesson here," she said gently. "This was never about credentials versus instinct, Dennis. It was about 2 different equally valuable kinds of knowledge, and the fact that we only had access to one of them in that hangar until Michael happened to walk by. Imagine what we could accomplish if we stopped treating those 2 kinds of knowledge as competitors and started treating them as partners instead." Dennis was silent for a long moment, absorbing that. "You want me involved in the training program?" he said, finally not quite a question. "I want your expertise shaping that curriculum alongside his," Victoria said. "I think the students would benefit enormously from both perspectives, the formal, structured knowledge you bring and the intuitive, hands-on troubleshooting instinct Michael brings. I think you'd learn something from working alongside him, and I think he'd learn something from working alongside you. That's not a threat to your 26 years, Dennis. That's an opportunity to make them even more valuable." Dennis exhaled slowly, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "I'll talk to him," he said. "See where things stand." The conversation between Dennis and Michael happened 3 days later, in the same hangar where Michael had first diagnosed the aircraft, both men standing near the same terminal where it had all begun. "I owe you an apology," Dennis said without much preamble. "I've been carrying around some resentment these past couple months, And it wasn't fair to you. You didn't do anything wrong. You just did something I couldn't, and I let that get tangled up with my own insecurities. Instead of just being grateful the aircraft got fixed." Michael considered him for a moment. "I appreciate you saying that," he said. "For what it's worth, I never once thought your 26 years didn't matter. I've been reading through the technical manuals your team put together for this aircraft. They're thorough, they're smart. I couldn't have built half of what you've built over your career, Dennis. I just got lucky enough to notice one specific thing that fell outside what those manuals covered." "Victoria wants me involved in the training curriculum," Dennis said. "Working alongside you, not underneath you or above you. Genuinely alongside." Michael extended his hand. "I'd like that," he said. "I could use someone who actually understands the formal side of this work as well as you do. My strengths are pretty specific. I imagine yours fill in a lot of gaps mine leaves open." Dennis shook his hand, something easing in his expression that had been tight for weeks. 26 years, he said half to himself, "and I'm about to learn something new from a guy who fixes navigation units out of his garage." "Way I see it," Michael said, "that's probably how it should work more often." The pilot cohort was selected over the following month. 20 students chosen from a pool of nearly 300 applicants. Teenagers and young adults from struggling neighborhoods across the region. Some referred through local high schools. Others found through community centers and veteran support programs. Michael had reached out to personally, remembering his own years in uniform and the young soldiers he'd watched pass through avionics training with talent nobody had ever properly nurtured. Among them was a 17-year-old named Marcus Webb, a quiet young man who had been suspended twice from his high school for reasons the administration described vaguely as disciplinary issues, but which on closer inspection during his interview turned out to be nothing more than a restless, understimulated mind that had never once been challenged in a way that held his attention. "Tell me about a time you fixed something," Michael asked him during the interview. The same question he asked every applicant more interested in the way they answered than in any formal resume they might present. Marcus hesitated. "My little brother's bike," he said finally. "Chain kept slipping off. I watched a couple videos online, figured out the derailleur was bent, straightened it out myself with a wrench and some patience. Took me 2 days of messing with it, but I got it right eventually." "Why'd you keep at it for 2 days instead of just asking somebody to fix it for you or buying a new bike?" Marcus shrugged, something flickering behind his eyes. Not defensiveness, but a kind of quiet stubbornness. Michael recognized immediately because he'd seen the exact same look in his own reflection more times than he could count. "Didn't feel right giving up on something just because it was hard the first day," Marcus said. "Figured if I kept looking at it different ways, I'd eventually see what I was missing." Michael smiled, something settling comfortably in his chest. "That's exactly the kind of thinking this program is built for," he said. "You're in if you want it." Marcus blinked clearly, not expecting the interview to end so decisively. "Just like that." "Just like that," Michael said. "Everything else you'll learn. That instinct you just described to me, that's the part that can't be taught. That's the part I was looking for." Yeah. The program launched on a bright morning in early spring. 20 students gathered in a repurposed section of one of Harrington Aerospace's smaller hangars, freshly outfitted with workstations, diagnostic terminals, and a wall of framed photographs. Victoria had insisted on hanging historical images of aviation pioneers. Alongside a single photograph, Michael had provided himself an old, slightly faded picture of his father standing beside a military aircraft decades earlier. His expression proud and unguarded, in a way Michael rarely remembered seeing in person. Michael stood at the front of the room that first morning, 20 pairs of nervous, uncertain eyes fixed on him, and felt a wave of emotion he hadn't fully anticipated. Something that mixed pride and grief and hope together into a feeling he didn't quite have a name for. "My father used to tell me," he began, "that before you replace anything broken, you need to understand why the system got scared in the first place. That lesson took me most of my life to fully understand, and I'm still learning new layers of it every single day. But I want you all to understand something before we even touch a single tool this morning." He paused, looking out over the room at Marcus, sitting near the front, at a young woman named Priscilla, who had traveled 2 hours by bus every day just to attend at every uncertain, hopeful face, waiting for him to continue. "None of you are here because someone decided to give you charity," Michael said. "You're here because somebody looked at your applications, your interviews, the way you talked about problems you'd solved in your own lives, and recognized something in you worth investing in. That's not charity. That's an investment. And investments only pay off if you show up and put in the work. I believe every single one of you can do that. But I need you to believe it too." Dennis stood near the back of the room, arms crossed, watching with an expression that had shifted over the past several months, from cautious skepticism into something closer to genuine respect. Victoria stood beside him, her own expression unreadable in the particular way it always was in professional settings, though something in her eyes watching Michael speak to that room full of hopeful young faces suggested she understood exactly what she'd helped build. The first weeks of the program were difficult in ways nobody had fully anticipated. 2 students dropped out within the first month, overwhelmed by the technical demands, or unable to balance the program alongside other responsibilities. Marcus struggled badly with the theoretical coursework Dennis insisted on including, nearly failing his first written exam, despite showing obvious natural aptitude during hands-on sessions. "I don't understand why I need to memorize all this," Marcus said one evening, frustration evident in his voice as he sat across from Michael in the nearly empty hangar textbooks spread open in front of him. "I can find the problem faster than half the older guys in here. Why do I need to know all these formulas if I already understand how the system actually works?" Michael sat down across from him, recognizing something of his own younger self in the boy's frustration. "You're right, that instinct matters," he said. "But instinct without a foundation eventually runs out of road, Marcus. There's going to come a day when the problem in front of you doesn't match anything your gut recognizes, and on that day, the formulas and the formal knowledge are what carry you the rest of the way. My father used to say, instinct gets you to the door, but knowledge is what opens it." Marcus was quiet for a moment, staring down at the textbook in front of him. "I'm scared I'm going to fail this," he admitted quietly. "Everybody's watching this program waiting to see if it works, or if it was just some feel-good story that falls apart the second it gets hard." "Then let's make sure it doesn't fall apart," Michael said. "Not because of pressure from outside, but because you and I both decide right now that you're not giving up on this. I'll sit with you every night this week, if that's what it takes. You already proved to me in your interview, you don't quit on something just because it's hard the first day. Prove it to yourself now too." They worked together for the rest of that week, and the week after, Michael breaking down complex formulas into the same plain, intuitive language his father had once used to teach him, until something in Marcus's understanding finally clicked into place, not memorization, but genuine comprehension, the kind that stuck. Marcus passed his retest 2 weeks later with a score that surprised even Dennis, who had quietly begun keeping a closer eye on the boy's progress after that first difficult exam. "He's got something real," Dennis admitted to Michael afterward. "Reminds me a little of you, honestly, the way he thinks through problems sideways instead of straight down the textbook path. He just needed someone to slow down long enough to meet him where he actually was," Michael said. "Same thing every kid in this program needs one way or another." 6 months after that difficult conversation in the boardroom, the pilot program's results were presented formally to Harrington Aerospace's board of directors. Completion rates, safety records, accreditation, confirmation from the partnered technical college, and most tellingly, the enthusiastic feedback from 3 separate maintenance companies who had already expressed interest in hiring graduates directly from the program once it concluded. Richard Ashford sat through the entire presentation without interrupting, studying the data with the same careful scrutiny he'd applied to every proposal Victoria had ever brought before the board. When it finally concluded, he was quiet for a long moment, flipping back through the printed report in front of him. 90% completion rate, he said eventually. 0 safety incidents, accreditation secured. 3 companies already lined up to hire graduates before the program has even officially concluded. He looked up first at Victoria, then at Michael, sitting once again at the far end of the long glass table, though with considerably more confidence than he'd carried into that same room 6 months earlier. "Mr. Carter, I owe you an apology. I was wrong to doubt this." "You weren't wrong to ask hard questions," Michael said. "That's part of what made sure we built this thing right instead of rushing it out half-formed. I'd rather answer to someone who demands proof than someone who just takes things on faith." Richard almost smiled at that something that might have been respect passing briefly across his weathered features. "I'd like to formally motion for full board approval of program expansion," he said, turning toward the rest of the table. 50 students in the next cohort. Permanent funding structure beyond the initial $3 million. This program has more than earned it. The motion passed unanimously. Victoria caught Michael's eye across the table as the meeting adjourned, something quiet and satisfied passing between them. Not triumph exactly, but the steady, hard-earned satisfaction of two people who had built something real out of nothing but a promise and a handshake 6 months earlier. Neither of them could have predicted sitting in that boardroom with the vote still fresh just how far the Carter Aviation Training Initiative would eventually travel, how many young lives it would reshape in the years ahead, or how a single quiet decision made in a small kitchen over a cup of cold coffee would go on to outlive both of them, carried forward by every student who ever walked through those hangar doors, carrying nothing but raw talent and the simple stubborn belief that they deserved a real chance. But for now, it was enough that the program was real. The vote was unanimous, and somewhere across the city, a 17-year-old boy named Marcus Webb was heading home to tell his family he'd just been offered his first real job interview before he'd even finished his training. Marcus Webb sat in the front row of a graduation ceremony 8 months later, dressed in a crisp new uniform embroidered with the logo of one of the region's most respected maintenance companies, and Michael watched him from the small stage at the front of the hangar. With a lump in his throat he hadn't expected to feel that morning. The pilot cohort had grown into something larger than any of them had dared hope a year earlier. What began as 20 uncertain teenagers crowded into a repurposed corner of a hangar had become a genuine institution. New facilities built specifically for the program, a permanent staff of instructors that now included both Michael and Dennis working side by side, and a waiting list of applicants that stretched into the hundreds drawn from struggling neighborhoods across 3 counties. Victoria stood near the back of the crowd that morning, arms crossed loosely rather than defensively. Now a posture Michael had come to recognize as her version of quiet pride. 18 months had changed something in her too. The sharp guarded edges she'd carried into that first hangar meeting had softened not from weakness, but from the particular kind of confidence that comes from watching a genuine risk pay off exactly the way you hoped it would. 18 students graduating today, she said, stepping up beside Michael as the ceremony organizers began arranging chairs for the families filling in behind the graduates. Every single one of them with a job offer already in hand. Do you have any idea how rare that is for any training program, let alone one that didn't even exist 2 years ago? "I try not to think about the numbers too much," Michael admitted. "Makes me nervous. I just try to focus on getting each one of them through it, one student at a time." "That's precisely why the numbers turned out this well," Victoria said. "You never once treated this like a statistic to manage. You treated it like 20 individual promises you intended to keep." Michael glanced out at the crowd, searching until he found the 2 faces he was looking for. Lily, now 9 years old, sitting in the 3rd row beside Mrs. Alvarez, her small hands clasped in her lap, watching the stage with the same wide, attentive eyes she'd had watching her father finish that lighthouse puzzle nearly 2 years earlier. Beside her sat a face Michael hadn't expected to see that morning, though it filled something in his chest he hadn't realized had been sitting empty. His father's old friend Walter Reyes, a retired avionics instructor. Robert Carter had worked alongside decades earlier, had traveled nearly 6 hours from out of state after reading about the program in a regional aviation newsletter. He'd reached out to Michael a month earlier, introducing himself with a story about the two of them arguing over torque specifications in a hangar sometime in the early 90s, and Michael had invited him to the ceremony almost on instinct, some part of him wanting his father represented by more than just a photograph on the wall. "Your dad used to talk about you constantly," Walter had told him the night before, sitting at Michael's kitchen table over coffee, the same table where Michael had once sat alone, weighing $3 million against a promise he hadn't yet fully understood. Even back then, before you'd finished a single year of formal training, he'd tell anyone who'd listen that his boy had a gift for seeing what other people missed. I always figured he was exaggerating the way proud fathers do. Walter had shaken his head slowly, gesturing toward the framed photograph of Robert Carter that now hung on the training center's wall. "Standing in that hangar yesterday, watching those kids work, watching you teach them the exact same way your father used to teach me. I don't think he was exaggerating at all." Michael had sat with that for a long moment, something warm and aching settling in his chest. "He never told me any of that directly," he said. "Not in so many words anyway. He wasn't really the type to say things like that out loud." "Some men aren't," Walter had agreed. "Doesn't mean they don't feel it just as deeply. Sometimes deeper because they don't have anywhere else to put it except into everything they build." That conversation stayed with Michael as he stood on the small stage, now watching Marcus Webb rise from his seat when his name was called, crossing the stage with the same quiet, deliberate confidence he'd shown in his very first interview nearly a year and a half earlier. "Marcus," Michael said, shaking his hand as he presented the boy with his certificate. "You remember what you told me in your interview about your brother's bike?" Marcus grinned, something easy and proud in his expression that hadn't been there during those difficult early weeks of struggling through theoretical coursework. "Told you I don't give up on something just because it's hard the first day." "You didn't," Michael said. "Not once in 18 months. I hope you know how proud I am of you." "Wouldn't have made it here without you sitting with me those nights," Marcus said quietly, his voice dropping beneath the ceremony's ambient noise meant only for Michael to hear. "Nobody ever did that for me before. Sat down and just believed I could figure it out, even when I didn't believe it myself." Michael felt his throat tighten, thinking of his own father, of countless evenings spent at a workbench with a patient, steady hand guiding him toward understanding he hadn't yet trusted in himself. "That's the whole point of this place, Marcus," he said. "Somebody did it for me once too. Now it's your turn to remember what that felt like whenever you're the one training somebody else someday." Marcus nodded, something solemn passing behind his eyes, and Michael understood, watching him walk off the stage toward his family, that the boy had genuinely absorbed the lesson. Not just the technical knowledge the program had given him, but the deeper current running beneath all of it. The one his father had spent 40 years trying to teach him about what knowledge was actually for. "Kids." The ceremony continued for another hour. 17 more names called. 17 more young people crossing that small stage with certificates in hand, and job offers waiting for them. Families in the crowd crying and cheering in equal measure. Michael shook every single hand, personally remembered something specific about every single student's journey, and by the time the last name was called, his voice had gone hoarse from talking, and his cheeks ached from smiling. Afterward, as the crowd dispersed into the warm afternoon sunlight outside the hangar, Lily found her father near the refreshment tables, tugging insistently at his sleeve. "Dad," she said, "Mrs. Alvarez said this is the biggest thing you've ever done, bigger than the airplane even." Michael knelt down to her level, considering the question seriously the way he always tried to with her. "I think she might be right," he admitted. "Fixing that airplane took 8 minutes, and a lot of luck lining up just right. This," he gestured toward the crowd of graduates and their families still celebrating around them. "This took almost 2 years, and it's still not finished. I think it might never really be finished, actually. I think that might be the whole point of it. Are you going to keep doing it forever?" "For as long as I'm able," Michael said. "And someday when I can't anymore, I'm hoping somebody like Marcus takes it over and keeps it going even longer than I ever could." Lily considered this with the serious, unblinking attention she brought to everything that mattered to her. "Like Grandpa's notebook," she said finally. "It just keeps going, doesn't it? Even after the person who started it is gone." Michael pulled her into a hug, something overwhelming rising in his chest that he didn't trust his voice to speak past for a moment. "Exactly like that," he managed eventually. "Exactly like that baby girl." Victoria approached a few minutes later, watching the exchange with an expression that had over the past 2 years become considerably warmer than the guarded, controlled composure she'd carried into their very first meeting. "I have some news," she said once Lily had run off to find Mrs. Alvarez among the dispersing crowd. "The board approved permanent unrestricted funding this morning, not just for the current program size, but for expansion into 2 additional regional locations over the next 3 years. We're looking at training capacity for nearly 400 students annually once it's fully built out." Michael stared at her for a moment, the number too large to fully absorb standing in the aftermath of an already emotional morning. 400 students a year, he repeated slowly. "There's something else." Victoria added something careful in her tone that made Michael brace himself slightly. "The board wants to rename the initiative more formally, officially incorporate it as an independent nonprofit, rather than simply a company program, which gives it protection and continuity beyond Harrington Aerospace's own corporate decisions going forward. Whatever happens to this company in the future, whoever eventually sits in my chair, the Carter Aviation Training Initiative would continue independently, permanently secured." "You're protecting it," Michael said quietly, understanding settling over him. "Even beyond your own involvement." "I'm protecting what we built," Victoria corrected gently, "because I've watched what it's done over these past 18 months. Mr. Carter and I refuse to let it become vulnerable to something as fragile as one company's changing priorities or one CEO's eventual retirement. This needs to outlast both of us." Michael thought of his father's handwritten note again, the one he'd read alone at his kitchen table the night everything had truly begun. "Fix that, and you'll fix more than any engine ever could." He hadn't fully understood that night just how far those words would eventually carry him. "Thank you," he said simply, "for actually meaning it, for not just writing a check and walking away." Victoria studied him for a long moment, something genuine and unguarded in her expression. "You once told me knowledge isn't something you're supposed to keep for yourself," she said. "I think I understand that lesson a lot better now than I did the day you first said it. This company built its reputation on precision, reliability, excellence, but I spent 11 years believing that reputation was something you protected by never showing weakness, never asking for help, never admitting you didn't have every answer." She glanced toward the crowd of graduates still celebrating nearby. "You taught me something different. Sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is admit they need help and trust that help arrives from places they never expected to look." Chaluo. 3 years passed, and the program continued exactly the way Victoria had promised, expanding into 2 new regional locations, training hundreds of young men and women who might otherwise have never found their way into an industry that had for generations quietly excluded people who looked and sounded and grew up like them. Michael kept his shop running the entire time, though he'd hired 2 part-time assistants to help manage the workload. Both of them, notably early graduates of the very program he'd helped build, young technicians who understood his particular way of thinking about problems, because he'd personally taught them how to think that way in the first place. Lily turned 12 that spring, tall and sharp-eyed, and increasingly curious about the work her father had spent years building, often accompanying him to the training center on weekends, sitting quietly in the back of classrooms, absorbing lessons about diagnostic thinking, the same way Michael had once absorbed them from his own father in a cramped garage decades earlier. "You know," Dennis said one afternoon, watching Lily help a struggling student untangle a wiring diagram during one of her weekend visits, patient and methodical in a way that mirrored her father almost exactly. "I think we might be looking at the next generation of this thing right there." Michael watched his daughter work, something quiet and proud settling deep in his chest. "She's got her grandfather's patience," he said, "more than I ever had at her age, honestly. Runs in the family, apparently," Dennis said, smiling. He'd become something close to a genuine friend over the past 3 years, their early tension long since dissolved into easy mutual respect. 2 men who approached the same problems from different angles, and had learned slowly to trust what the other brought to the table. Marcus Webb, meanwhile, had risen quickly through the ranks of the maintenance company that hired him straight out of the program, promoted twice in 3 years, and had begun quietly mentoring newer graduates, the same way Michael had once mentored him, sitting with struggling students late into the evening, breaking down complicated concepts into plain patient language, refusing to let anyone give up on themselves just because something felt hard on the first attempt. He returned to the training center one afternoon that same spring, not as a graduate anymore, but as a guest instructor invited to speak with the current cohort about what the certification had actually meant for his life beyond the classroom. 2 years ago, Marcus told the room of nervous, hopeful students, most of them not much younger than he'd been when he first walked through those same doors. "I was sitting exactly where you're sitting, terrified I was going to fail out of a program that felt like the only real chance I'd ever gotten. I nearly quit during my first month, failed my first big exam so badly I genuinely thought about walking away for good." He paused, glancing toward the back of the room where Michael stood quietly, arms crossed, listening. "But somebody sat with me every single night that week," Marcus continued, "and refused to let me believe I wasn't capable of understanding something just because it didn't come easy the first time. That's the whole secret of this place, honestly. Nobody here cares whether you already know everything walking in the door. They just care whether you're willing to keep showing up when it gets difficult." He looked out at the room, meeting the nervous eyes of students who reminded him painfully of himself not so long ago. "I promise you, if I could do it, every single one of you can too." Michael listened to every word, thinking of his father's notebook, sitting safely at home on his nightstand, thinking of a small kitchen table and a cup of cold coffee, thinking of a decision that had once felt impossibly uncertain, and now 3 years later had grown into something that had reshaped hundreds of lives he might never have otherwise touched. Victoria found him afterward, standing near the wall of photographs, where his father's picture still hung faded and proud beside images of the program's earliest graduating classes. "I got a call this morning," she said, "from a regional aviation council. They want to model a similar training initiative in 2 other states based directly on what we've built here. They're calling it the Carter model in their internal proposal documents." Michael turned from the photographs, something quietly overwhelmed passing across his face. "The Carter model," he repeated slowly. "Your father's name is going to outlive both of us at this point," Victoria said gently. "Whatever else happens to this company, whatever happens to either of our careers, eventually, that name, that idea, it's not going anywhere now. It's bigger than us." Michael looked back at the photograph of his father, standing proud beside a military aircraft, decades earlier. A young man who had spent his entire life quietly frustrated that talented people kept getting overlooked, who had poured that frustration into 40 years of handwritten notes, never intended for anyone but his own son, and who had died without ever knowing just how far those notes would eventually travel. He would have hated all this attention honestly, Michael said, a small fond smile tugging at his mouth. He was never comfortable with recognition, used to get embarrassed whenever anyone thanked him for anything. "Then it's fortunate," Victoria said, "that this was never really about recognition. It was about passing something forward. I think that's a legacy he'd have been proud of, even if the attention made him uncomfortable." Michael nodded slowly, something settling deep and permanent in his chest. Not closure exactly, because the work was nowhere near finished, but a kind of peace he hadn't fully expected to find on the other side of everything that had started with a broken navigation file and an overheard sentence in a hangar 3 years earlier. That evening, he drove home the same way he had for years past, the same streets through the same neighborhood, though everything about his life had quietly transformed since the last time he'd made this drive, without knowing what waited for him at the end of it. Lily was waiting on the porch when he pulled into the driveway. Older, now taller, already talking excitedly about a new puzzle she wanted to start that weekend. A replica of an airplane she'd told him proudly, because she'd decided somewhere over the past few months that she wanted to understand engines the way her father and grandfather always had. "You know," Michael said, sitting down beside her on the porch steps as the evening light softened around them. Your grandfather used to tell me that the value of knowledge was never in keeping it for yourself. It was in passing it forward. I don't think I ever really understood what that meant until these last few years. Do you understand it now? Lily asked. Michael thought of Marcus Webb standing in front of a room of nervous new students, passing forward exactly what had once been passed to him. He thought of Dennis, 26 years of hard-earned expertise, now woven into a curriculum that would outlast every one of them. He thought of hundreds of young men and women who had walked through those hangar doors uncertain and afraid, and walked back out with real skills, real futures, real belief in themselves that nobody had ever handed them before. Yeah, he said quietly. I think I finally do. He looked out at the quiet street in front of their small house at the porch light, glowing warm against the gathering dusk, and thought about a simple truth his father had spent an entire lifetime trying to teach him. One small correction at a time, in a cramped garage that had once felt like the whole world, and had somehow impossibly grown into something so much larger, that the most important repairs a person ever makes rarely involve engines at all. They happen in the quiet, unglamorous moments nobody claps for a father teaching his son patiently night after night without ever expecting anything in return. A single dad choosing against every practical instinct to give away $3 million because he believed something bigger mattered more. A CEO learning slowly and honestly that real strength sometimes looks like admitting you don't have every answer. And somewhere in a hangar that had once sat silent and broken for 6 impossible days, hundreds of young lives now moved forward every single year, carrying with them the same simple lesson a father had once written in the back of an old worn notebook. That before you give up on anything broken, you owe it the patience to understand why it was ever afraid in the first place. That was Michael Carter's real legacy. Not the aircraft he fixed in 5 minutes, but the doors he spent the rest of his life quietly holding open for everyone the world had once overlooked, proving once and for all that the greatest fortune a person can ever build isn't measured in dollars, but in every single life they lift up along the way.